So in today's first video from a dietitian, you are going to learn about B12, what it is, where it comes from, how much you should get, and how it's absorbed and metabolized in your body. So stay tuned and share this video with anybody who you think needs to know more about B12 on a vegan diet. So B12 on a vegan diet is really important, and I hope by the end of this video that you'll be able to share this with those who have questions about B12, concerns, and you are well educated moving forward on if you should supplement or if your diet is adequate enough. So first we're going to talk about what even is B12. We know that B12 is a vitamin, but more importantly it is a water-soluble vitamin. This means that it's really hard to essentially overdose on it. Anything that our body doesn't need will be excreted through our urine. This vitamin has a lot of roles in our body, and oftentimes these little vitamins can get overlooked, but it has really important functions such as energy, metabolism, and facilitating a lot of different reactions in our body. It's also really important in red blood cell formation, and this can result in a deficiency that leads to a certain type of anemia. It's also responsible for neurological functions in our body. And lastly, it's responsible for proper DNA formation. So certainly not something that we want to be deficient in. So the metabolism of B12 is a little bit more complicated than I'm going to make it out to be in this clip, but I just want to make it really easy to understand. We're going to refer to this nice little drawing as our stomach, and where it's ending there is going to be the small intestine, starting with the duodenum. So B12 is going to enter our body via food or a supplement. Now, if you're a carnivore, B12 actually enters in the flesh of the animal product you're eating and has to undergo a separate step of breaking off from the protein that it's bound to in the animal product, such as, let's say, the chicken. So for us as vegans, B12 isn't bound to anything because we are not eating it through animal products. So it's just going to go directly into our stomach, and it's going to arrive there and need some help. I like to refer this as a little analogy of going on a date to the dance. So B12 is going to need some help on its way to the dance in order to be properly absorbed by our body. And from this, we need something called R proteins. So B12 is going to bind to R proteins, and I'd like to think of this as the taxi cab over to the date, to the dance, whatever you want to call it. So these R proteins are excreted by our salivary glands, which comes from our oral digestion of masticating or chewing in our mouth when we're eating these foods. So our proteins are going to join the party and going to escort B12 over to the rest of the digestion. But first we need our date to our dance. So the date to our dance that is going to take B12 all the way through digestion is called the intrinsic factor. Now the intrinsic factor is produced by certain cells in your stomach, and actually in certain conditions you cannot produce intrinsic factor, and those who have different atrophies in their stomach may not be able to properly absorb B12 due to this. But we're going to just say in a normal healthy human, B12 is needed to properly, intrinsic factor is needed to properly absorb B12, and that is going to be B12's date to the dance. And like I said, B12 comes in, binds to our protein. Our protein is our taxi cab, and intrinsic factor is going to meet us on the way there. So here you'll see that I'm drawing intrinsic factor coming out of the stomach cells. That is our date to the dance. Then all three of these are going to travel to the duodenum. The duodenum is the first part of our small intestine, and then it goes to the jejunum and then the ileum. So B12 actually doesn't get completely absorbed until the ileum, which is the furthermost part of our small intestine, but they're going to all three travel together to the duodenum, which I like to say the duodenum is the dance, and our protein and B12 need to get to the dance to meet up with intrinsic factor. So B12 and its shuttle R protein are going to head on over to the duodenum. At this point, our protein is going to break away from B12. It's done its job. It's taken B12 to the dance, and intrinsic factor, our date, is going to meet them there. So you can see here that they are both there, but our protein is no longer. It is gone. It is on to its next Uber ride. So B12 and intrinsic factor are now there together as dates, ready to go on to be digested. And like I said, this is going to happen in the ileum, which is the latter-most part of our small intestine, but I'm not going to draw out your whole small intestine here. So we're just going to imagine that our protein breaks away from that, B12 and intrinsic factor have a happy old date all the way down to our ileum. I like to make note that you can see me here struggling to figure out if absorption is spelled with a P or B. I may be a dietitian with a 4-year degree, but still mess up on stupid stuff like that. So now that we know what B12 is and how it's metabolized in our body, let's talk about why, as vegans eating a plant-based diet, we need to make sure that we're getting B12 because plants don't naturally have B12. There really aren't any plant foods that are naturally high sources of B12. And this is because B12 is an anaerobic bacterial byproduct. Anaerobic bacteria means that they don't need oxygen in order to live, so B12 is produced by these bacteria through different fermentation products. Now, animals such as cows make their own B12 because they have different compartments in their stomach and different digestive tracts, and their digestive tracts produce their own B12 through these anaerobic bacteria for them. So foods can also be fortified with vitamin B12. Most often this is going to come in forms of cereals, breads, protein powders, plant-based milks, things like that. So it's important if you're going to rely on that to make sure you're looking at how much those foods are fortified. Oh, and a quick little note here that if they aren't producing their own B12, they are getting it by eating poop of those who do produce their own B12. So please don't get any ideas there. So if plants can't produce their own B12 and we don't really maybe eat foods that are fortified with B12 or not very often, how do we get B12 when we're eating a vegan diet? So my number one recommendation as a dietitian would be supplementation. This is going to be a really cheap insurance pill pretty much for you to make sure that you do not become deficient in B12. So you're going to see supplements in two different forms, methylcobalamin and cyanocobalamin. And both of these work. The only difference is methylcobalamin is the ready-to-use form by your body, and cyanocobalamin needs extra conversion to turn it into methylcobalamin. So not really anything wrong with that. Pick a supplement and take it on a regular basis. You can also use B12 fortified foods, such like I said, grains, protein powders, nutritional yeast, different plant-based milks, but if you're going to do this, you need to pay really attention and be tracking that you're eating enough of this fortified food B12 every day. Now you may hear that there are some naturally occurring B12 in fermented foods. No, this is not a reliable source of B12 for you to be getting, so please do not rely on these fermented foods to get your B12. So lastly, let's talk about the recommended daily amount of B12. How much is too much and how much should we be eating / supplementing? So go ahead and find the lowest supplement of B12 you can find. Oftentimes that's going to be more than you need. So you could take that 3 to 5 times a week. Or you can choose to supplement with a multivitamin. Those typically have a lower amount of B12 in it. And I apologize, I kind of cut myself out of frame here, but the recommended daily amount is 2.4 micrograms a day for males and females ages 17 to 70. And I'm totally out of frame here, but I'm going to come back up in a second. 2.8 milligrams micrograms, per day for lactating women. This ensures that your breast milk has enough B12 for your little baby to be getting enough B12 in their diet. And then it's going to be 2.6 micrograms a day for those females who are pregnant and producing a baby. Lastly, because you can see here that the intrinsic factor comes from certain cells in your stomach, there can be certain GI conditions or simply age that will cause you to not be able to produce enough intrinsic factor. And if that is the case, you are not able to correctly absorb B12. And if you're not able to absorb B12 due to these conditions, you may need a subcutaneous shot of B12, which goes directly into your muscles and does not need intrinsic factor to be metabolized. So overall, take a B12 supplement. This is a super cheap insurance pill that is water soluble. It's not going to build up and become toxic in your system. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really hope you learned how to properly supplement or eat B12 on a vegan diet. And nonetheless, if you already knew how, hopefully you can share this with a friend or a group who is new to a vegan diet or is curious or doesn't think they should supplement with B12. So from your dietitian to you, please ask me questions in the comments below and hopefully I can answer them. And stay tuned next week so we can go over more nutrients that you need to know about on a vegan diet. Bye guys!